CoGTA Minister Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma this week said the devastating flooding that occurred in KwaZulu-Natal is a sign of climate change, adding that flooding in the province has worsened over the last 5 years. For years now, scientists have been warning about changes of climate change and worsening extreme weather events as a result. Now, let's discuss this further. We are joined now by Professor Coleen Vogel. She's a climatologist, adaptation and sustainability specialist. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Pleasure.
Prof, as I said in my intro, scientists are warning that the floods we are seeing in KZN and the drought in some parts of the country are just a taste of bigger things to come. Is it too late, perhaps, to turn things around? And just how worse can it really get?
Well, I think if readers are interested, you know, the recent scientific reports or assessments known as the assessments have now all been completed, and those contain a lot of details around what will be happening in the future. I think most scientists are saying we're already experiencing climate change, and unfortunately for many, the projections are that it is going to get much, much more extreme. The magnitude and the severity could increase. And so there are models we can start saying very more firmly than we could have, say, 10, 15 years ago. So I think governments and others are now starting to wake up. Unfortunately, I think in many cases it's a little bit slow. I wouldn't say it's late, but I think it's slow. We need to be doing much, much more. I was involved in 2002 in helping to write the disaster risk reduction policy for this country, and we were talking about this already in 2002. And so, you know, a la COVID, whether it's COVID, climate change, we've got many risks that we're needing to manage.
What happened to that report of 2002, Prof? You said that you were part of those engagements. I mean, where did that end up?
So that's been implemented, it's been rolled out. We've got various levels of disaster management officers. As you've heard, it's all the disaster management agencies from the various local, provincial and national levels, as you've seen on your footage in your own news reports, that have been activated. But I think in the report, what was really clear in that early legislation, we were calling for what we call vulnerability assessments. In other words, mapping out in various areas which groups of people will be most at risk if we had severe floods or we had droughts. So it was called for in that legislation, and now we've actually amended that legislation to include climate change. And so I would urge, the interministerial committees to take these reports. We've got the Presidential Commission that's now working on climate change, and to really start to engage with these reports. You know, in 2019, we've done some work just very briefly, and we've had events exactly almost like this one that we just saw recently. And so it's not as if we were caught by surprise. And that's the thing, I think. We really need to start hunkering down and taking these things seriously, doing the work that we're supposed to be doing the development practice that would prevent, I think, some of these risks. Because to move people is really unfair, but by the same token, to place people at risk initially is extremely, almost immoral and unfair. And so I do think we as scientists, together with various practitioner groups, NGOs, civic society, etc., must now come together and really start doing our work and not hiding behind, oh, it was a natural disaster. These are not natural disasters. These are created partly by our gaseous emissions that we are emitting and also our development planning, etc.
I mean, if you look at the heavy rains that we saw in Durban, particularly, some areas recorded over 300 millimeters in just 24 hours, which is about a third of the annual rainfall in KwaZulu-Natal. And if I have to just listen and take what you just said in terms of the vulnerability assessment and other risks assessments that were done many years ago, as you've rightfully said, and just looking at the disaster management units that we are seeing placed in every province, would you say that a lot of the implementations that were meant to happen, particularly from the research that has been done in this country, dating back many years, would you say that these units that are supposed to be on the ready were fully resourced? Were they capable of even, managing this one particular disaster?
That's a very, very difficult question. I think, we've got the right people in the places, but I do think the issue is not about emergency response. It's more about risk reduction, and that's the difference. We shouldn't be wiping up only. I really feel for the people, and my condolences to all of those who've lost their lives. But we should be reducing risks beforehand. That means before we get to these circumstances, so that even if the big storms come, which they are going to come, that the actual receiving community, landscape, whatever you want to call it, is much more buffered to stand that shock. And so, you saw it in Germany. I've got colleagues who work in Bangladesh. They're starting to mobilize schools, teachers, to get early warning messages going much, much more quickly. They're starting to engage with communities around better building designs, et cetera, et cetera. So there is so much to do. And I think, to say that, some people say the disaster management groups are the kind of Cinderella departments. I think those days are over. We've really got to now elevate disaster risk reduction into the mainstream in all our departments. It shouldn't be seen to be only separate. So water affairs should be at the table. Housing should be at the table. Land development, all the land issues should be being discussed with an eye to the future in terms of climate change. It shouldn't be siloed, and then when the emergency happens, oh my gosh, we all run around. It's too late then. And so we are calling for this kind of much more effective, what we call in the science jargon, a systems approach. And I think these shocks are now starting to wake people up. And unfortunately, it's coming at the loss of life, which I think is really, we could have done more. I think we could have done a lot more, but I do think that we need to commend the relief that is taking place and hope that that relief reaches the people and is not, disappears somewhere. And so, but I do think the science is there. We are ready to work with communities. Durban, the University of KZN, for example, there are scholars there who are working in Quarry Road. They've been doing disaster risk reduction with the communities. The communities are now aware of flooding, and we need more of that, much, much more quickly, so that we can prepare people and be enabled to work with people so that we don't have these unfortunate tragic losses. So there's much to be done, and all I want to say is that we're not starting from scratch. We've been doing this for many, many, many years. Drought, floods, COVID. You talk about these issues. These are issues, obviously, that are shocks and extremes, but we've got the underlying science and the capacity and the goodwill, I think, of people to really make a difference, so that next time this happens, it might still cause death, but maybe not at the same rate and magnitude.
Prof, I can tell you that the systems approach you speak of is not only a science jargon, but also works very well in business, taking into consideration that approach, which clearly looks at the mess that we are currently sitting with, just looking at it from that approach. Talk to us about the practical steps South Africa and the rest of the African continent can take now if we are to even begin to talk about, turning things around. I'm particularly interested in the environmental practices that we can take now to reduce the impact of climate change.
Sure. Well, I wish you had a few hours because I could talk to you for quite a long time about this. We call them complex wicked problems that we're dealing with. They're very complex. And so I'll just give you a bit of a flavor. So, obviously our planning, where we plan, how we build, do we build in wetlands? Do we have the environmental impact legislation, which is in place, but is it now really starting to also factor in climate change? I think that discourse is starting to happen. The Presidential Commission is already talking about adaptation. We do have policy and, plans that various governments have already put into place, their adaptation plans. So it's not as if I really want to convince listeners that it's not as if we are ignorant in the country. In South Africa, we actually punch way above our weight at the international delegations and the meetings at the COPs. But we need to be transferring that back down onto the ground and working in a social justice way so that, we really start looking at this seriously. So the one thing is, yes, I agree with you, the environmental side of things and where we build, how we build. Do we clean up the drains, the stormwater drains? It's almost kind of, let's do the business that we should be doing, just better. Let's be accountable. Let's do the implementation. One of the tragedies that I feel as a scientist is that we just don't have data. So if we want to now go and do loss and damage assessments of these floods, it'll take days for us to find that data. We should have the systems already that you can work out exactly who's died, who's lost their homes, how they're going to be compensated, in what ways, because it's going to take months for this to come out. And that's really a problem. So it's multifaceted, and I think, there's a lot to be done. And I think the lessons from COVID, we should be building into climate change. Let's not now have multiple disasters that are now really stretching us in all different directions. We should be piggybacking on what we've learned from COVID. Let's now take that, sit down with government, sit down with civil society, sit with the Quarry Road people who are already sitting with academics at UKZN and with members from eThekwini municipality. Professor Deborah Roberts is a key figure in climate change right there in the city of eThekwini, and she could tell the municipality a lot of advice. She could give a lot of advice, and I'm sure she is already. So we just need to work more cohesively together and not allow a biscuits and blankets approach to dominate. I think people are very grateful for biscuits and blankets, but you can't be dishing out biscuits and blankets. You've got to be making sure that people do have we call it resilience or the robustness to stand firm when this happens again. And it sounds easy to talk in my home here in Johannesburg as an academic. It's really, really hard. So I'm not knocking anyone, please. I'm not trying to say people aren't doing their best. I think they are. I think we're all trying to help all those unfortunate people who have been so devastated, as you can see in the footage which is playing alongside me here. But we really need now to start taking this seriously. If it's flooding today, it could be droughts tomorrow. It could be heat waves the next day. And we've been saying it. We've been talking about it. We've been showing how we can do this. Now we've really just got to start doing it.
And in fact, other provinces that are on high alert are the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. But Prof, talking about dishing things out, one of the things we cannot afford to continue dishing out as a country is poor infrastructure. Just going forward and looking at the countries that you've mentioned, South Africa can invest in water smart cities. So if that is the actual case, how would that help in dealing with deadly floods, as an example?
It would be a huge help. But I think we've got to be careful again. The tendency sometimes in South Africa is that we'll take ideas that come from outside Africa and we'll try and retrofit them into South Africa or into Africa. And our contexts are different. So in some cases, we need advanced technology. Yes, absolutely. But in other cases, we need maybe simpler ways of doing things, but just more effective ways of doing things, ensuring that the maintenance is kept up to speed, etc. There are infrastructural panels that are now working with the president. And so, talking to those panels, we sit on an adaptation technical forum with the Department of Environment and others. And we're now going to be meeting and talking and raising these issues of infrastructure. So starting these discussions, but not just having talk shops, really starting to do the science and the way of trying to think about this as if this is now a different way of living, if you like. We're now moving into this. I don't want to call it the new normal because that sounds very trite, but we really need to be starting to think about these things in a much more proactive way. I think there's a lot to do. And one of the things I just want to quickly get in, many of us are now thinking of how can we do risk reduction now, working with the youth who are unemployed? How can we start to be looking at green skills, training up people, climate literacy? All these things could be filling and ticking a number of boxes, if you like, although I don't like that analogy. We don't want to just tick boxes. We really want to make a difference to people's well-being. And if we can do that, we could solve a number of things all at the same time. So I hope listeners just hopefully are not walking around saying, oh my gosh, these are sudden events that happen and they shock us. And then we've got to clean up. We've got to start realizing that these are things that could become much, much more familiar. But if we're ready for them, like our colleagues in Bangladesh, like other countries who are similar to us in some ways, if we can learn those lessons, apply them, adapt them, and work collectively as a humanity in a just way, I think we could go a long way to be better prepared the next time round.
Professor Coleen Vogel, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I wish everyone the best as they go through this terrible ordeal.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Professor Coleen Vogel there is a climatologist, adaptation and sustainability